You have to admit that Putin has played the West like a fiddle again. I'm no fan of Putin, but as a political leader, you have to admit that he is head and shoulders above anything that we can offer in the West. Putin is playing chess, whilst the UK and America are playing with their My Little Ponies. So what's he done? Well, whilst the talk ramped up about Syria and ISIS and ousting Assad, Putin just bided his time. And whilst America and the UK were running around telling anyone that would listen that they need airstrikes on ISIS in Syria with possible boots on the ground and also with talk of them removing Assad, Putin was quietly watching the situation unfold from the sidelines. Then a couple of weeks ago, whilst Cameron was battling allegations of putting his penis in a dead pig's mouth, and about how on the way to a birthday as an 11-year-old on Concorde, he sipped champagne. Whilst that was going on, Putin moved 28 planes to bases in Syria. Russian parliament grants Vladimir Putin right to deploy military in Syria. Vladimir Putin has received permission from parliament for Russian forces to take place in bombing raids in Syria, 2 days after the Russian leader spoke at the UN and called for an international coalition against terrorism to fight Islamic State. So, having been granted permission by the Russian parliament and having been asked to help by the Syrian government, Russia took to the skies of Syria yesterday and started bombing. Look how Russia's first strikes are reported by The Guardian. US accuses Russia of throwing gasoline on fire of Syrian civil war. Washington has accused Moscow of throwing gasoline on the fire of the Syrian civil war, rejecting Russia's claims that its first airstrikes in the war-torn country had targeted Islamic State terrorists. In a dramatic escalation of the conflict in Syria, Russia launched a series of airstrikes on Wednesday that it said was aimed at ISIS terrorists, but which many appeared to hit less extreme groups fighting Bashar al-Assad's regime. Russian airstrikes in Syria kill civilians. Dozens of civilians, including 5 children, have allegedly been killed in Russia's first airstrikes in Syria, a claim strongly denied by Moscow. The Syrian National Council, a group opposed to President Assad, claimed 36 people died in strikes north of Homs. The group's leader, Khaled Koja, said there were no Islamic State forces in the 4 areas hit on Wednesday. Now, when America talk about civilians being killed, they are so hypocritical. Bear in mind that they apparently kill 49 citizens with drone strikes for every 1 suspected terrorist that they kill. And let's be honest, I personally do not believe a word the American government tell me. They lie all of the time. That is all the American government does. The American government said that the Russian strikes will backfire. But look at this. Buried deep inside the Telegraph's live section regarding the airstrikes, we have this. US officials have now said that at least 1 strike directly targeted rebels that were trained and supported by the US, according to the Wall Street Journal. You see, what Putin has done, very cleverly, is target the US-backed rebels who just also happen to be Al-Qaeda and ISIS, meaning that there is now an outpouring in the West of how dare you bomb the rebels that the US were supporting, arming and funding and training, proving that the US were in fact supporting, arming, funding and training Al-Qaeda and Syria in Syria all along. It looks like those conspiracy theorists were right again. The West say that they're training, arming and funding what they call slightly more moderate rebels. I think the slightly more moderate rebels must take 3 or 4 swipes to cut your head off, as opposed to the really bad rebels who just do it in one go. When people read in their newspapers in the UK that Russia bombed US-supported rebels in Syria, I'm hoping that the penny may just drop, and they may now realise that they've been lied to about Syria the whole time, and that the US and the West have been actively stirring up the tensions for geopolitical reasons. They've wanted to take over Syria for years, as General Wesley Clark was told back in 2001.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq? Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
It also gives meaning to this clip from ex-DIA boss Michael Flynn, who said it was a willful decision of the Obama administration to arm, fund, and train ISIS in Syria.
In 2012, your agency was saying, quote, "The Salafists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq are the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria." Mm-hmm. In 2012, the US was helping coordinate arms transfers to those same groups. Why did you not stop that if you're worried about the rise of quote-unquote Islamic extremism?
I mean, I hate to say it's not my job, but my job was to ensure that the accuracy of our intelligence that was being presented was as good as it could be. And I will tell you, it goes before 2012. I mean, when we were in Iraq, and we still had decisions to be made before there was a decision to pull out of Iraq in 2011. I mean, it was very clear what we were going to face.
Well, I admire your frankness on this subject.
Very clear what we were going to face.
Let me just take one before we move on, just to clarify once more. You are basically saying that even in government at the time, you knew those groups were around, you saw this analysis, and you were arguing against it. But who wasn't listening?
I think the administration.
The administration turned a blind eye to your analysis.
I don't know if they turned a blind eye. I think it was a decision. I think it was a willful decision.
A willful decision to go support an insurgency that had Salafists, Al-Qaeda, and the Muslim Brotherhood.
A willful decision to do what they're doing.
A few days ago, David Cameron was running around like a pig without a head, telling everyone that the only answer to stop the war in Syria and the refugee crisis was to bomb ISIS and to also remove Assad. But now the calls for a vote on bombing Syria in the UK have gone somewhat quiet. It may still happen. The UK Parliament may vote on bombing ISIS in Syria and removing Assad. But if MPs do get another vote on whether to bomb Syria or not, there should now be a very different question to the original "shall we bomb ISIS in Syria" question. What MPs should now be asked, but even if they aren't actually asked this question, then they should have enough awareness about them to realise the reality of the situation in Syria now is this. They should be asked, should we bomb Syria to stop ISIS and to help the US-backed rebels that are beheading people and killing Christians, but who are also fighting Assad? This may ultimately lead to a confrontation with not only Assad, but also now with Russia, and will have the potential to escalate into a massive regional, possibly a world war. Vote now, please. By bombing where he has, Putin has won, shown the world that America are in fact backing rebel ISIS fighters in Syria with the sole purpose to take out Assad. The West themselves have now admitted as much. No longer can this be deemed a conspiracy theory. Like I said, it's another conspiracy theory that just so happened to be true all along. And 2, he's made getting involved in Syria becoming a possible war with Russia. And who wants that? In this article, Piers Morgan, who I just can't stand, says the following: "Thank God there's a strong president willing to stand up for American interests in the Middle East. Shame it's not Obama." He goes on to say this: Today, Putin won authorization from the Russian parliament to throw his full military weight behind Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and launch immediate airstrikes in Syria against the Islamic State. He's decided the time for jaw-jawing about ISIS is over. It's time to properly war. What Morgan doesn't get, amongst other things, and also like 99% of other journalists, is that Obama didn't want to get involved in Syria because he would be fighting the very forces he's arming, funding, and training, i.e. ISIS. And what Putin has very cleverly done is highlight this with his strategic bombing. As a result of what Putin has done, a full conflict in Syria could now possibly be averted. Or is that just me wishful thinking? We'll have to wait and see just how insane our leaders truly are.